Hello, welcome back to our channel. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch my video. Everything I create is purely speculative and based on my personal opinions and interpretations. So who is the liar trying to manipulate Nicole? And who is the liar claiming to protect her? And could both of these men be connected to the plasma circle? There are moments in life that do not begin with a loud explosion or arrive through an obvious collapse. Instead, they slip in quietly. Through that cold feeling running down your spine when you suddenly realize that everything you trusted for so long was only a glossy coat of paint covering something rotten underneath. For Nicole, that collapse did not come from one single betrayal. It came from the terrifying overlap between two men who seemed completely different. One entered her life like a fresh breeze after years of exhaustion, carrying the kind of maturity, experience, and subtle attentiveness that could make even an intelligent woman want to believe, just for a moment, that she deserved another chance. The other was a familiar shadow from the past, a presence shaped by patience stretched across decades, the kind of devotion that always stood at the thin line between loyalty and obsession. But what truly horrified Nicole was not that one of them was lying. It was that both of them were lying in eerily similar ways, as if they stood on opposite sides of a battlefield yet served the same fear, the same secret, the same darkness that was never meant to be named. At first, Nicole tried to convince herself that this unease was nothing more than the natural reaction of a woman whose life had pushed her through too many painful crossroads. Kial had appeared at exactly the right time to seem suspicious. A traveling orthopedic doctor, a widower carrying just enough sorrow in his past to stir sympathy, yet still vague enough to remain impossible to fully grasp. He talked a lot, perhaps far too much, about the hospitals, the clinics, the cities he had passed through, the patients he had treated, and the twists and turns of his unstable career. On the surface, it sounded like the explanation of a worldly man trying to justify why he had never planted roots anywhere for very long. But the more Nicole listened, the more it stopped sounding like honesty and started feeling like a prepared testimony. As if Kial had memorized every fragment of his life story so that no one would ever catch the empty spaces in between. A man who had truly lived that life would not need to emphasize it so carefully. Only someone afraid of being exposed would work so hard to make his story sound complete. Even his decision to settle in the DMV area no longer felt like a simple career move. It felt like a calculated landing, a planned arrival, and that made Nicole begin to wonder whether she was truly his destination or merely a doorway leading to something bigger, deeper, and darker behind the Dupree family. But if Kial unsettled Nicole with a kind of perfection that felt new, Carlton suffocated her with a familiarity that had become dangerous. For a long time, Nicole had believed that Carlton's quiet feelings for her were at least sincere. His affection could make her uncomfortable. It could create pressure, but it had seemed cleaner than the games of power she had seen in other men. It was only when she was finally free, finally able to choose her own life, that Nicole began to understand that Carlton's gaze was not simply the look of a man who had loved her for years. There was waiting in it, but also ambition, and a sense of possession disguised beneath patience. Carlton behaved as if he had endured long enough that now it was finally his turn to claim a reward, as if all those years of standing behind her, quietly watching, quietly helping, quietly appearing at exactly the right time, had somehow earned him a certain right to Nicole's heart. That realization made Nicole angrier than anything else. Because hypocrisy does not always come from an enemy. Sometimes it comes from the person still smiling at you, from the one who says he only wants to protect you, when in truth he wants to decide for you. What began connecting in Nicole's mind did not come from one shocking revelation, but from small details that were too unreasonable to dismiss as coincidence. She noticed that every time she questioned Kial about a gap in his past, he used the exact same type of response Carlton had always used whenever she asked about his sudden disappearances. It was not that their answers were identical in content. It was the rhythm of it, the way they redirected the conversation, the way they made Nicole feel as though she were overreacting, as though everything was just a misunderstanding, as though whatever they had done had only been done to keep her safe. The word safe itself began to disgust Nicole. Both men claimed they wanted to protect her, but neither of them truly believed she had the right to know the truth in order to protect herself. Both hid behind the language of love. Both used concern as an excuse to manipulate the rhythm of the story. Both tried to control what Nicole was allowed to see, hear, and believe. And the more painfully she thought about it, the more she realized that Kial and Carlton were not only alike in the way they spoke, but also in the moments when they reacted almost in sync to a name that should never have stirred the same sensitivity in both of them. That name came to Nicole by accident on what should have been an ordinary evening while she was sorting through old medical paperwork and a few misplaced appointments. It was only a small detail, a repeated notation on a handful of scattered documents, a name that sounded both scientific and secretive, Plasma Circle. At first, Nicole did not think much of it. It could have been the name of a research fund, a medical grant program, a professional experimental project involving plasma or restorative treatment. But both her professional instincts and the instincts of a woman who had been betrayed before told her the phrase was anything but harmless. Her vague suspicion turned into real fire when she casually mentioned that name into different situations and got the same reaction from both Kial and Carlton. A very brief freeze, followed by immediate concealment. They were not looking at each other, but their responses felt like reflections in the same mirror. A pause to breathe for others to notice, yet too identical for Nicole to miss. In that instant, she knew she had touched a live nerve. From that moment on, everything changed. Kial was no longer simply an attractive man with a complicated past. Carlton was no longer the pitiful longtime admirer from years gone by. They became two different faces of the same hypocrisy. Nicole began investigating quietly instead of waiting for more carefully rehearsed explanations. She compared Carlton's schedule, the times he claimed he had family events, the nights he disappeared without any clear reason, and the stretches of time that had once seemed harmless but now overlapped with unusual activity around certain medical facilities loosely connected to private research programs. At the same time, she traced back the places Kial claimed to have worked, only to discover that his professional record was suspiciously spotless. Not incomplete, but too neat, too polished, as though someone had already cleaned away every messy trace of a real life. Hidden beneath that perfect surface were time gaps that did not fully align, vague connections to prestigious yet quiet hospitals, and a handful of medical programs whose names had changed multiple times over the years, as though someone had been trying to erase the old past and dress the present in a new title. Nicole did not need to know the full truth immediately to understand something even more terrifying. Kial had not entered her life by accident, and Carlton had not stayed by her side for so long by accident either. Even if each man was hiding a different half of the truth, both were standing at the edge of the same abyss. What made Nicole furious beyond the point of return was not simply the deceit, but the fact that both men viewed her as someone who needed to be directed. Kial used gentleness, maturity, and the wounds of his past to build the image of a damaged man still noble enough to love again. Carlton used history, endurance, and years of constant presence to make every suspicion against him seem unfair. One played the victim of fate, the other played the hero of patience. But underneath, they were doing the same thing. They were taking away Nicole's right to choose by refusing to let her know what she was standing in the middle of. They wanted her to love in confusion, to trust in half-truths, to open her heart while both of them were still wearing armor. That was not love. It was violation wrapped in paper labeled protection. Even before the full truth came out, enough had surfaced to shatter Nicole's trust. She understood that the most dangerous thing now was not that she still did not know everything, but that if she stayed caught between them, she would slowly be pulled into the very network both men were trying to hide. From that point on, her decision to walk away from both Kial and Carlton at the same time was no longer the impulsive reaction of a wounded woman. It was the first act of self-defense by a woman who had finally realized she was surrounded by two different forms of dishonesty. Nicole cut ties with Kial because she could not continue placing her heart in the hands of a man whose past was full of holes, whose present was too smooth, and whose reaction to the name Plasma Circle was far too sharp and cold. She cut ties with Carlton because she could not accept that a man claiming to love her had quietly turned years of affection into an invisible permit to intrude, control, possess, and hide things from her. That decision did not bring her peace, it hurt her. It enraged her. It made her feel as though she were cutting away her last chance at happiness with her own hands. But even that pain felt cleaner than continuing to live inside a fog built by two men who both wanted her to believe that blindness was the same thing as trust. After Nicole left them both without hesitation, the masks each man had worn began to crack in different ways. Kial could no longer maintain the calm image of the worldly, composed man he had worked so hard to project. Beneath that calm, he revealed the panic of someone who knew he was not only losing a woman, but also risking the loss of the strategic position he had carefully maneuvered himself into. That realization chilled Nicole even more, because in every gesture of his desperation, every attempt to soothe her, every effort to hold on, she no longer saw pure love. She saw the outline of a man scrambling to save a collapsing plan. Carlton, meanwhile, instead of accepting that Nicole had every right to reject him, revealed the bitterness of a man who felt something he had long believed would belong to him had been stolen away. The kindness he had built so carefully suddenly showed cracks filled with anger that had been suppressed for too long. He was not just hurt by rejection. He was furious that Nicole had dared to see him differently, dared to break the beautiful story he had told himself for years about patience, devotion, and the reward he believed he had earned. In that fury, Nicole saw more clearly than ever who he really was. Not a man who loved her unconditionally, but a man who believed the time he had invested should eventually buy him access to her. From that point on, the breakup stopped being the end of a love triangle and became the opening gunshot of a hidden war. Nicole understood that by stepping away, she had destroyed the balance both Kial and Carlton needed in order to keep concealing their own secrets. If their hostility toward each other had once been real, or perhaps partly staged, then the moment Nicole left, they were forced to reveal more of themselves. The similarity in their words and reactions was no longer the only thing that kept Nicole on guard. She began to notice separate efforts from each of them to control the flow of information, block questions, erase traces, and steer the thinking of everyone around them. That only confirmed a terrifying possibility. Either they had known each other long before Nicole realized it, or they were both tied to a larger force moving the pieces of the board from the shadows. Plasma Circle therefore stopped being just a name on paper. It became the center of every gap, every lie, every disappearance, and every averted glance. The deeper Nicole dug, the more she realized she was touching something that went far beyond her personal life. Plasma Circle could be a closed group, a corrupted medical project, a network of power dealings hiding behind the mask of professional research, or worse, a place where human beings were treated as assets, as data, as bargaining tools for those wealthy and ruthless enough to believe morality was a luxury meant only for the weak. Kial may have entered that world through his profession, through a buried medical experiment, through a mistake he could never reverse, or through a dark past he had been running from for years. Carlton may not wear a doctor's coat, but he understood systems, knew how to move through respectable facades, and knew how to use social connections to shield the meetings he called family events. And if that was true, then the most horrifying thing was not simply that one of these men had lied to Nicole. It was that both of them had stood so close to her while knowing perfectly well that she was walking right along the edge of an abyss. But Nicole was never the kind of woman meant to stay silent once she had been backed into the dark. Her anger was no longer the anger of someone hurt in love. It had become the anger of someone who finally understood just how deeply she had been underestimated. She could not forgive Kial for turning charm into a soft trap. She could not forgive Carlton for turning patience into invisible chains. And perhaps most painfully of all, she could not forgive herself for once wanting to believe that after all her old wounds, life had finally sent her men who understood the meaning of respect. Now, looking back, she saw only two different faces of the same hypocrisy. Mouths speaking of protection while hands hid the truth. Mouths speaking of love while hearts were full of calculation. Mouths claiming to honor Nicole's choices while every move they made had been designed to distort those choices from the beginning. And it was in that most painful moment that Nicole also became the most dangerous version of herself. Because once a woman who had spent so long trying to preserve decency finally decides she will never again be led around in circles, she stops being the one caught in the middle of two men fighting over her. She becomes the one person clear-eyed enough to tear apart the game they thought they controlled. The breakup, then, did not end the story. It only marked the moment Nicole stopped being the target and started becoming a genuine threat to every secret Kial and Carlton were trying to bury. Because once trust is dead, what remains is not just pain. What remains is the will to know the entire truth, no matter the cost. Even if that cost is the destruction of every beautiful image she once held in her mind. And if Plasma Circle truly is the door leading to an underground network of power, a buried file of medical experimentation, or a bloodstained past in which both Kial and Carlton played a part, then the first person to drag that door into the light may not be a police officer, an investigator, or an outside enemy. It may be Nicole, the woman who has just lost her last illusion and therefore has nothing left to fear.